So that is the 48th. But nothing's going to be worse than Dr.
Okay, you guys ready to rock? Okay, we left off with the border states. Is this cool? All right. So we talked last class about Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky. So just a little brief review on that. Remember, Delaware was about the easiest border state to stay in the Union. They voted pretty quickly to stay in the Union in January. Maryland was a little trickier because people in the western counties of Maryland and the northern counties of Maryland were Unionists. They wanted to stay in the Union. The Chesapeake Bay, tobacco-growing, slaveholding counties were more secessionists. It obviously made it even more difficult because Thomas Hicks was kind of playing, he was the governor of Maryland at the time, kind of playing both sides where he wasn't really a secessionist. He was technically a Unionist, but he didn't want troops marching on Maryland. Well, troops had to march through Maryland, and we learned what happened on April 19th. What happened in Baltimore? The Baltimore riots, and in response, Thomas Hicks has the bridges burnt down so to prevent more soldiers from coming in. This angers Lincoln. Lincoln's going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and Maryland is going to be a bit divided. There are going to be people that fight on both sides. However, I don't think I talked about this last class, but I want to bring it up. The railroads will actually so since they're not going to be able to come through Baltimore, soldiers will be rerouted through Annapolis to get to Washington, D.C. And this is a major feat under the command of Benjamin Butler, the Beast, who we'll talk more about later. And then moving on to Kentucky, remember Maryland will stay in the Union. There will be additional attempts to try to bring and sway more folks in Maryland to the Confederacy. And then we talked about Kentucky, and Kentucky is really a important state for Lincoln personally. It's his birth state, but it's also strategically important. What is important about Kentucky? What waterway? The Ohio, very good, Gavin. The Ohio is tremendously important, and I think Mac brought this up last class. Cincinnati doesn't seem, it's a great city, it's a lot of fun, there's a lot going on there, and a lot of, it's still a major American city. But at this period of time, in the American postbellum pre-Civil War era, the antebellum Civil War era, Cincinnati is a industrial powerhouse, and it's weapons manufacturing. In fact, to lose Cincinnati, a lot of people, or the Union felt, if Cincinnati fell, Ohio might fall with it. So we talked a bit about that. We talked about how soldiers from both sides are going to end up serving, or men are going to serve on both sides of the war from the state of Kentucky, but Kentucky will stay in the Union. Missouri is our next border state that we're going to take a look at. Missouri claims that the Civil War began with them, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and all of the events of Bleeding Kansas. That really the first battles of Bleeding Kansas started in 1855, and then they're going to go on into the almost 1860 into 1859. So I put the year 1856 is because that's like where the most battles occurred in that particular year. So in 1861, Missouri was under control of a pro-slavery secessionist border ruffian by the name of Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson. And he had been a border ruffian commander of militia forces during Bleeding Kansas. He wants Missouri to secede, and he decides the best way for Missouri to secede is to capture the arsenal and the city of St. Louis. And you have to understand that the federal arsenal at St. Louis was the largest federal arsenal in the trans-Mississippian southern region of the United States. So it's significantly important. Jefferson Davis is going to back this plan, but what you need to keep in mind is that there was a West Pointer, a captain by the name of Nathaniel Lyon, that had control of the arsenal, and Lyon is going to, who is a Unionist, he wants to keep the arsenal in the hands of the Union. He is going to be supported by Congressman Francis P. Blair of that sort of like dynastic Blair family. They were connected, they were sort of a Washington dynastic political family. Lyon's going to not only hold the arsenal, but will also successfully take Camp Jackson near St. Louis as well. This is actually a pretty interesting piece of reconnaissance that I wanted to share. I think it's kind of like, I don't know, I think it's a cool little story from the Civil War. So Blair wants to make sure that major like improved muskets that have been, rifled muskets that have been produced from the arsenal don't fall into the hands of the Confederates. And what happens is this like elaborate bait and switch where Lyon has old flintlock muskets sent out, and pro-Confederate secessionists will seize these flintlock muskets and think that they've gotten the newer weapons, but all the while Lyon has sent by steamboat along the Mississippi the new weapons that will fall in the hands of Union forces. Another interesting thing is that Lyon needed to do recon on Camp Jackson because remember, most Confederate, like most southern federal camps and forts fell out of Union hands pretty easily. So in order to do recon on this, Lyon dressed up as, posed as Francis P. Blair's mother-in-law. So he dressed up in like a dress and a shawl and came through Camp Jackson in a carriage to do recon and figured out like where their weakest positions were. So when they launched this attack on May 10 and 11, he and his soldiers are going to easily take the camp because he had done that recon dressed as or posing as Congressman Blair's mother-in-law. So here we have Nathaniel Lyon on the left, West Point class of 1841, Claiborne Fox Jackson. So this is, I'm taking one from McPherson here. This, what McPherson dubbed was the Fox and the Lion, this particular conflict that occurs throughout the summer of 1861. So the earliest engagements were in May, and the last sort of decisive battle is going to be in August. So we're looking around May 10 to about August 10 for military action between Lyon and Jackson. All right, so Lyon's men, again, got tangled up with pro-Confederate militia on May 10th and 11th, where they will successfully take Camp Jackson, but it will also lead to mob rule and riots in the streets of St. Louis. Lyon and the Union will successfully hold the fort, hold St. Louis, hold the Capitol, and hold pretty much all of northeast and actually all of the northern portion of Missouri as a result of this event. But 47 soldiers and two soldiers and 45 civilians were killed as a result of this. So these are some of the earliest deaths in the American Civil War. Secessionists also attacked a number of German American militia as well. So a lot of German Americans and German settlers that had relocated or had immigrated to this area, a lot of them had to move to different places because they were seen as unionists, abolitionists during this era of conflict. And I guess you could call it sort of like a continuation of the sort of bleeding, seems like a continuation of the Bleeding Kansas events, but it's really like kind of like the start of not kind of, it's definitely the start of conflict in what is we would refer to as the Western Theater. So Jackson's ready for war, as is Lyon. Former Governor Sterling Price decides to take control of the remaining pro-Confederate militias in Missouri. So Lyon and Price skirmish in Jefferson City on June 17th, 1861. So you have forces actually coming in to Missouri from all directions. North, south, east, west, forces are pouring into the state to prepare for war. So somebody we've already talked about, Sam did some research on, and somebody else, who else did research on John C. Fremont out there? Yeah, Donovan. Okay, so Fremont, hero of the Bear Republic, also had run as the first Republican candidate for president in the election of 1856. He's dispatched as commander of the Union's Western Department. And also keep in mind that Colonel Franz Sigel, another German American, is going to have a command out in the Western theater as well. Fremont, Lyon, who's been now promoted as a result of these early engagements from captain to brigadier general, and Franz Sigel are preparing to eliminate Price's militia forces. And this would also be known as the Missouri Guard as well. So on August 10th, Price's men were reinforced by Confederate General Ben McCullough. He was a Texas Ranger. He had served in the Texas Revolution. And this became known as the Battle of Wilson's Creek. What occurs in this particular battle, this is like what we would consider the Bull Run of the West. Essentially, Lyon's men are located north on Wilson Street, just south of Springfield, Missouri. They are holding a position of vulnerability on this particular creek. And in the first engagement between Lyon and Price's men, Lyon is successful, but Price's men retreat to a place called Bloody Hill, which is higher ground. And this is going to lead to them having a more strategic defensive position. And then things go a little bit haywire for the Union, because during the engagement, and this battle lasts all like throughout from morning till early afternoon. Lyon will be killed. He's the first general on either side of the war to be killed in battle, and his command has to be handed over. And as a result of that, the Union soldiers break into a retreat in the north, and this will lead to a Confederate victory. I want to make this very clear to everybody. Prior to this battle, the Union had won all of the engagements and had kept control of Missouri, but as a result of the death of Lyon, which was a pretty significant loss for the Union Army, and for the defeat of this battle, the Confederacy and the Border Ruffians, and we're going to start referring to the Border Ruffians now as bushwhackers. So I don't want you guys to like be confused about that, because most of the former Border Ruffians, like Bloody Bill Anderson, William Quantrill, Frank and Jesse James, the Younger brothers, those guys, they're no longer really Border Ruffians. They're not really partisans either. They're bushwhackers. So we'll talk more about them as we move forward, because I've got a whole segment of a lesson dedicated to the bushwhackers of Missouri. So what bushwhackers would have been pro-Confederate, like Missouri Guard or Missouri militia. Casualties, both sides combined, were about 1,200, which was pretty significant. It's not as large as Bull Run, but still missing, killed, wounded. When I say casualties, missing, killed, wounded would be the whole lot, whether they were injured in battle, whether they were lost as prisoners, whether they were lost as deserters, or whether they were actually killed. So this was a Confederate victory. Here we have Sterling Price on the left and John C. Fremont on the right. And then this just kind of shows you the Confederate positions on the southern portion of Wilson's Creek, the Union position on the northern portion of Wilson's Creek. You can see where here on Bloody Hill, Confederates will take the high ground. Also to keep in mind here, the reason I brought Fran Siegel up, we're going to talk more. Siegel will be involved in additional lessons because he will get a command. He'll be promoted and gain a larger command later. His column was routed in this particular battle as well. At the end of the day, what I want you guys to realize is that this was a very disorganized battle. The soldiers on both sides were not prepared, just as what we will see in the end of Lesson 5, and that's the Battle of Bull Run. Missouri concluded, as a result of Wilson's Creek, Fremont wants to regain control of southern Missouri, so he planned to enforce martial law throughout the state. He wanted to also pass an emancipation edict and wanted to hand out the death penalty to bushwhackers and guerrilla fighters. Lincoln says no because he's fearful that Missouri might end up seceding, which technically, this is going to sound weird, but they do. However, they actually end up staying in the Union. There is a convention for secession, and fire eaters and pro-Confederate folks wanted to go, but the actual government stays in the Union. So Fremont decides to take control of the army for himself, and he attempts to ignore the president's orders. He's actually pretty lucky he didn't get court-martialed here, or worse. Lincoln removes Fremont from command, puts General Henry W. Halleck in control. We're going to talk more about Halleck in Lesson 6. We'll actually talk about Fremont in Lesson 6 as well. Halleck was a very organized tactician, really in every facet. His nickname was Old Brains. I've talked a little bit about Halleck before. Halleck was the guy that, when he got out to Missouri, he had to go to a local general store and bookstore and buy updated maps because the Union's maps were out of date for the Western campaign. So here's the breakdown for Missouri. About 80,000 white soldiers and about 8,000 African-American men fought on the side of the Union, while about 30,000 men fought for the Confederacy, and about 3,000 of those would be bushwhackers, which would be Confederate guerrillas. Yeah. That's the thing. It depends on the store they would have gone in. Chances are like that they might have gone to a Unionist bookstore, or a Unionist general store to be able to get the or if it would have been an pro-slavery thing, as Robin said, they may have sent dispatch or spies and take care of that. Andrew.
Well, you said that the Unions have as good maps, but who is making the maps? Is it one of the unions, those surveys?
Well, so here's how you have to think about it. If cartographers and map makers had made more accurate maps in Missouri, why would anyone in Washington, maybe in Washington, but why would folks have updated maps of the state of Missouri? Probably.
I would think that, the government, especially the military, would have.
This is actually a really big, this is a huge problem for the Union in the early years of the war. Most of their southern maps were outdated. Yeah. And another problem too is that the maps that they do have, and that's again goes back to the one thing that the Union has on a map that they can keep up with, can't change, are waterways. Roads change, right? Not to mention the fact that Confederates get into, especially the guerrillas, get into the business of burning down bridges, cutting down trees to block roads. It's like the same tactics that you would have seen in the, in the Revolutionary era, where any type of sabotage along the way, no map can really, defend against that. But the problem that a lot of the folks had in the Western theater is that some of those Western theater maps, they were not even, not only were they not updated, they didn't have accurate maps on like new counties that had been developed. They didn't have accurate maps on even towns that had been established at that period of time, much less roads.
Oh, there's a town here around there. They use the water because water was
Right. They knew that the creeks and rivers would stay the same.
Okay.
So that's why we see the Union naming a lot of their battles after waterways, and the Confederates name their battles after towns.
Okay. I know that they use water as transport. Was there ever a time in which they were blockaded by water, like someone cut down a bunch of trees and flowed?
One of the greatest water, there is a incredible water blockade we're going to talk about, and that's on the Mississippi with the Battle of Vicksburg. That's a really good question. There's some incredible Confederate water blockades to keep themselves, to keep the Union out. But that doesn't always work out. Andrew, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. They just didn't have, it wasn't in every case, but a lot of it, they just didn't have it, they just weren't. Here's old brains, there's old Henry Halleck. We'll take a look at Halleck's, we'll take a look at Halleck a little bit more in detail when we get into lesson 6. All right, so we talked about this, we scratched on the surface of this briefly in our last class. So this is Western Virginia and West Virginia. The Western Virginia campaign and the break of West Virginia from Virginia, a lot of that had to do with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. B&O was extremely important to both the Union and the Confederacy in the western portion of Virginia. The Union wanted to keep the railroad open in Union hands in 1861. Confederate Colonel George Porterfield and Virginia forces concentrated a force of 775 recruits in the town of Philippi, West Virginia, then Virginia, now West Virginia, in May of 1861. On June 3rd, a Union column led by General Thomas A. Morris and the Indiana Volunteers launched a two-prong attack, which is known as a pincer movement, or also known as the double envelope, which is basically, let's say that we're located, let's say this is our encampment, and then we have somebody hit us from the side of this computer lab and the side of the front hall, and they attack us. Well, we have one of two places to go. We're either going to go that way or the other way because we're not in any position to fight. So this pincer movement was successful. In fact, the Confederates retreat from the town. The Union will control the town, and they will call them the Philippi Races because Confederates were running out of the town so quickly. This kind of just shows you how unprepared for war a lot of these militia forces were during the time. Union General George B. McClellan, Little Mac, a West Pointer, William Rosecrans, another West Pointer. Again, I'll be talking in detail about these individuals' backgrounds in lesson 6. Led the Department of Ohio in Western Virginia campaign. and the Department of Ohio will continue on into the war. So this is from June to December. Confederate forces were led by General Robert Garnett, and he will be defeated at the Battle of Laurel Hill and Rich Mountain, and Garnett will be the first Confederate general killed in the war at Carnifex Ferry, which was Cork's Ford near Carnifex Ferry, not far from Laurel and Rich Mountains. You all are probably very familiar with Laurel Hill, Rich Mountain, and Sheep Mountain. How many of you guys have gone to snowshoe before? Anybody? That is the area in which they were fighting. How hardcore is that? That is some brutal terrain to fight on. What's that? So if you are driving, if you head over to Crossing Afton Mountain, get to Stanton, you, instead of going north toward Harrisonburg or south toward Roanoke, if you keep going west from Stanton and you drive, I think it's Route 33, it takes you up into that area, but the mountain passes are like up, down, up, down. It's actually not too far from where I grew up. Yeah. Oh, of course. So Rosecrans' forces defeat John B. Floyd. He was the guy that was Secretary of War under Buchanan at Carnifex Ferry. Again, not all these locations are close to one another. Laurel Hill, Rich Mountain, Cork's Ford, Carnifex Ferry, in and around like between. It's kind of like not far from Marlington, West Virginia, Snowshoe, and Monterey, Virginia, in that area. So Confederates sent Robert E. Lee to regain the Western Virginia sort of counties from the Union control, but Lee was unable to win at the Battle of Sheep Mountain, and a lot of people started calling Lee Granny General and Granny Lee, but he was only in his early 50s at the start of the war. He wasn't that old of a general. He actually was probably the most experienced officer on either side of the war at this point, with the exception of Albert Sidney Johnston, which he had served all the way back to the Texas Revolution. One thing that Lee does do, though, is he prevents McClellan and Rosecrans from entering the Shenandoah Valley. I think I showed you guys this primary dock before, right? This is a primary dock that I think is kind of cool. It's an early sketch, one of the earliest sketches from a soldier in the Civil War. This is the encampment after the Union took control following the Battle of Philippi. Here we have Rosecrans on the left. There's little Mac on the right. Robert S. Garnett on the left, first Confederate general to die in the war. There's John B. Floyd. We're not done with him. We'll talk more about John Buchanan Floyd as we move forward. And then there's Robert Edward Lee on the right in his Union uniform. So, West Virginia officially breaks from Virginia, which we talked about before. The Western Virginia counties are the Trans-Allegheny counties in Appalachia, would remain under Union control. Most of the people in the area of Virginia didn't really want to stay with Virginia because they felt there was like this political dissent that they felt like Richmond and the East did not have their best interests in seceding. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is that they didn't really have use for a lot of slave labor. The majority of your slave labor in the Western Virginia counties would have been in the iron industry and in some cases the hospitality industry, which I know sounds kind of weird, but that was actually happening at this period of time. Like, has anybody ever heard of the Homestead before? Bath County, Virginia? Well, Hot Springs Hotel, that all got on the map, and the Jefferson Pools got on the map because people like Thomas Jefferson would go and visit and go into the natural springs and sit, and so created like this sort of like resort type of. I mean, the Homestead's been around since 1776. That resort. If you've never visited, I would highly recommend it. It's really incredible. Who's been up there? Anybody been up there? Pretty awesome, huh? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah.
All right, so delegates from 34 counties in the western portion of the state met in Wheeling in the Wheeling Conventions. We call these the first and second Wheeling Conventions. They met in Wheeling, West Virginia to vote for secession. They were led by who will become the first governor of West Virginia, Arthur I. Borman. West Virginia, originally named Kanawha, will officially become a Union or U.S. state on June 20th, 1863. But by all accounts, they had seceded in 1861. So an estimated 25,000 men from West Virginia fought for the Union and about 15,000 fought for the Confederacy. And do keep in mind that the West Virginia border war, we will continue talking about that as we move forward. We'll be talking about some military action that occur in the western counties, in the border counties. We'll also be talking about some events that occurred not far from where I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign. Has anybody ever heard of the Valley Campaign before? In 1862. We'll get into that a bit later as well. So, again, rebellious border war between Virginians and West Virginians, between families, partisans. Are you familiar with what I mean by partisans? Partisans are like highly respected spies, right? We wouldn't put them in that bushwhacker category. A partisan is somebody that like the military command recognizes, but they don't really, they're not officially attached to any one particular unit, but they're recognized. It's kind of like a band of spies, sharpshooters, and dispatches that work together on their home turf. We're going to learn about some really significant partisans. Bushwhackers and guerrillas, like a lot of them, like they were like sort of like pillage and plundering throughout the war. Partisans were not really into that. They were like plain clothed people during the day and fighting at night. Andrew.
Because I'm kind of familiar with the partisans in World War II, especially Italian and Soviet partisans.
Sure.
But when I wonder, why weren't there really partisans in like around New York or Maine? Think that there'd be something better.
I mean, because the war didn't make its way up there. I mean, the farthest battle is going to be in Pennsylvania, and then you could technically call the New York City draft riots a battle, but for the most part, the reason the partisans are going to be a Southern thing is because 99% of the war, or 99 point, whatever percent of the war was fought in the South. Is that, yeah.
Where did the Confederate
From the river. We've talked about it.
Why did they decide to not keep it?
I don't know. I like to, probably the convention. I'm not sure. We'd have to take a look at that. All right, so here's the Harper's Weekly. I don't know if you guys saw, I've got an entire book of the Harper's Weekly periodicals. So I'm going to give you guys some access to those so you can pull some of the Harper's Weekly primary docs. Okay, East Tennessee is a pretty quick story. East Tennessee, Lincoln wants to take East Tennessee as wants to see East Tennessee split from West Tennessee, as West Virginia had split from Virginia. So Unionist George H. Thomas, who was a Virginia born in Southampton County, he actually lived through Nat Turner Rebellion. He remains a Unionist. His army will be led by, or a dispatch will be led by General Don Carlos Buell. The idea was to move the army into East Tennessee to try to push for secession from the West, but the winter of 61 to 62 approached. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what the terrain looks like in East Tennessee. It's pretty much Appalachia, so this would be very difficult terrain to dig in on. Another thing that Thomas and a lot of the Unionists found out was that a lot of the folks in East Tennessee were Unionists, and therefore they needed to focus the strategy more on controlling the Mississippi River, taking control of Chattanooga, and also following through with the Anaconda Plan and taking two significant other rivers that flow through the state, the Tennessee and the Cumberland. So plans to lead a Unionist rebellion or Unionist secession movement in East Tennessee will be abandoned. But do keep in mind that East Tennessee is going to create, they're going to have their own sort of guerrilla style warfare and their own border war that will occur during the war as well. Cool. Was that at the Wheeling Convention? Awesome. So the choice, the decision to go with West Virginia, not Kanawha, was at the Wheeling Convention. All right, so I've got a couple of other things I want to go over here before we take a break. Unprepared for war, Union nor Confederacy were prepared for any major engagements. Most of the soldiers on both sides early in the war would have been considered green, because most of the fighting force guys, those who had served in the Mexican War, those who had served all the way back to the Texas Revolution, if they had been involved in that engagement, or in wars against the Apache, Comanche, Black Hawk, these are older individuals who are now in command. They were, yes, they would be fighting in the field, but they were not the 17, 18, 19-year-old young men who were taking up arms. Those men had not served in any major engagement. The Union only had 16,000 men ready to fight at the start of the war in the first year. Most of them were spread all around the country. In fact, Lincoln was devastated after the Baltimore riots. He was fearful that no troops were going to show up in Washington following the burning of the bridges in and around Baltimore. But to his surprise, the soldiers were rerouted through Annapolis, and here comes the 7th New York and the boys from Rhode Island and other Union soldiers coming in, being brought into Washington, D.C. A third of U.S. officers resigned to join the Confederacy, because mainly due to what reason? Exactly. Regional ties. There's a really incredible documentary I want to share with you guys. It's about the West Pointers that are going to be tied to each other throughout the war, and how it's a very somber moment. It's actually done on Smithsonian, I believe. Very somber moment when secession occurs and these guys part ways. All right, well, see you later. And where are these guys going to see each other? Well, on the battlefield. So that leads to another. That's another level of the Brothers' War in this situation. The way I would compare it is, a lot of you guys have grown up together, right? And a lot of you guys have been through school and sports and other extracurriculars, and imagine if tomorrow you all had to decide that you were going to fight on one side or the other of each other. That would be pretty difficult. All right. Some, not a lot, of Confederate soldiers went with their wives. What does that mean? Their wives told them what to do. That's pretty funny.
Their wives are more or less like, hey, I think that this would be the better option, and they were just like, or either that or they just completely left.
I'm actually looking for something else. You guys are on the right track.
Does it mean that they didn't fight?
Their wives told them what to do. Their wives, and as Michelle brought up, their wives said it would be a better idea for them to leave. Their wives were Southern. They went, Union men went with their Southern wives and fought on the side of the Confederacy.
Well, I know that Grant had a son, Grant, he had a son,
But he stayed in the Union. He stayed in the Union. Pemberton, the guy that surrendered to Grant at Vicksburg, he was Pennsylvania. So that was rare. Old Fuss and Feathers was the only general that had any major experience and a major military command. Do keep in mind that his aide-de-camp, his right-hand man, and the guy that he wanted to see take control of the Union Army was Robert E. Lee. But Robert E. Lee will refuse, saying he would not turn his sword against his native state of Virginia. Talk a little bit more about that later. I talked about Halleck having to buy maps from a bookstore when he took command in the Western Theater. State militias were not trained as they had in the past. A lot of guys were just mustered in militia forces, meaning brought up in militia forces as a good reason to booze it up and hang out. It was kind of like a boys' club on the weekend, not any. In fact, a little bit about my alma mater, Virginia Military Institute. The militia that was stationed at VMI was an arsenal established as a result of the War of 1812. The militia that was established at VMI caused so many drunken brawls in Lexington that they had to do away with them. So that's why they decided to turn it into a military college, was because there was too many drunken fights in uptown in Lexington. Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit more about VMI later when we talk about the preparation of war, Battle of Newmarket, etc. No one could predict the length of how long or bloody the war was. Some politicians said the amount of blood shed in this war will fill a lady's thimble. One man said, I will, as I think you heard Shelby Foote talk about, the handkerchief. It would take one handkerchief to clean up all the blood of the war. But another guy had a different prediction that you guys are very familiar with, and that is William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was the commandant of the Louisiana Military Institute, which is now, and I know I've got one Tiger in here, maybe more. Any LSU fans in here? Louisiana State University was a military college before it became a state college. And he was the commandant there, and Sherman said, this is going to be a long war. Why would Sherman predict a long war? He's Ohio born. He's a West Pointer. And he's a commandant at a southern, I mean, this was with tears in his eyes as he resigns as commandant of what is now Louisiana State University, at the time was a military institute. He says, no, this is not going to last. This is not going to be a short-term scenario. That's a good point. Nobody knows what they're doing, and it's going to get really messy. That's a good point. What's another thing? Be bold. Share out. What do you think? Okay? Pride, and that both sides, not just the Confederacy, both sides have very smart people and very, very capable commanders who will not back down from each other over the issue of pride and honor. All right? And He actually, we'll talk more, yeah, stubbornness, right?
Yeah.
He's gonna end up with a command in the east. He'll serve in Bull Run. We'll talk more about Sherman before he makes his way. He actually was committed for a time, and really famous quote between he and Grant. He says, "I was there for Grant when he was drunk, and Grant was there for me when I was crazy." I think that's hilarious. He actually was committed for a time for insanity or for melancholy. So we'll talk a little bit more about Sherman in this lesson and in lesson 6. Actually, Sherman will be with us much of the rest of the course. Let's look at recruitment and supply. On May 3rd, 1861, Lincoln called for 42,000 3-year volunteers, 23,000 regular Army, 18,000 sailors for the Navy. Congress approved 1 million soldiers to enlist in 1861. 700,000 volunteers would answer the call on the 3-year contracts. Every 100 men were forced into a company. 10 companies made a regiment. Both sides used the model because they were both trained in it. Both sides actually used Napoleonic tactics up until about midway through the war, until those tactics were obsolete. Company officers were typically elected by their men. State governors commissioned regimental officers. There's a lot of politics involved in military command in this war, and that has a lot to do with the war dragging out. National governments established the War Department and commissioned commanders on both sides, and these appointments depended on a variety of factors: military experience, wealth, political connections. So this is a 14th Connecticut Infantry. Rally, men, rally. This is a broadside for men to muster at Apollo Hall in Norwich, Connecticut. Location of another military college, Norwich. Recruitment and supply continued. Companies and regiments came from a lot of the same towns and counties. So like Stonewall Brigade, who we're going to be talking about at the end of this lesson and into the course, they came from the Shenandoah Valley, Roberts County, Virginia. Early in the war, states and localities provided uniforms and equipment. We already talked about the Zouave, 11th New York, dressed in those French drill uniforms. So it wasn't until 1862 that uniform was actually uniform. A lot of the Confederates wore butternut, as I talked about before they were able to even afford gray. Both sides lacked equipment during the training phases: lack of ammo, lack of transportation, lack of food, lack of clothing. Ironically, Confederate ordnance was a sort of like a shining beacon for them, and the Union ordnance was a nightmare. Do you know what I mean by ordnance? Supply. Support and supply. Okay? The Union removed Secretary of War Simon Cameron by January of 1862. Many Confederate volunteers came to training armed with their own equipment for war. Confederates mustered into makeshift camps like Fort Lee, Harper's Ferry. Cadets from colleges like VMI trained many Confederate soldiers that were old enough to be their fathers. So here we have the Zouave uniform on the left, and on the right, those are the Mobile Cadets that trained soldiers in Alabama. This is just a sketch. I think he's looking as shocked as you all are at that uniform. That would definitely not be the uniform I would want to go, So this was the 11th, that was the 11th New York's drill uniform.
Is he wearing stockings?
Those are spats, boots and spats. It's like a leather or cloth to keep your pants out of the mud.
Like warmers?
All right. So why did they fight? This directly relates to the assignment that that you guys have due next, the writing assignment. To become citizen soldiers on both sides, adventure, honor, and duty on both sides, political and financial gain on both sides, revolution and patriotism on both sides, political and ideological beliefs on both sides, defense of the homeland for the Confederacy, the preservation of the Constitution and the Union for the Union Army, to defend the South against tyranny for the Confederacy, and then states' rights and the preservation of slavery for the Confederacy. Notice I did not put up there to abolish slavery. I did not put that up there because that is not a Union aim yet. It will not become a Union aim until about halfway through the war to abolish slavery. That is not a Union goal for the fighting soldier. On the left here, we've got Confederate soldiers mustered in Richmond in 1861. And on the right, we have members of the 7th Kansas Cavalry that served in the Union in 1861. And then just to, this one, kind of hits close to home for me, and for any of you all that might have connections to VMI. These are young soldiers from the Virginia Military Institute, some of which will end up serving in the military before, and some will serve during the Battle of Newmarket. So we're going to talk about that when we move into the war. And do keep in mind that in all military colleges, soldiers ended up being divided. So don't think that like every cadet from VMI fought on the side of the Confederacy. A lot of them did fight on the side of the Union. Not a lot, but a number did. West Point was really divided. Naval Academy was divided. There's one really famous Brothers War situation that I wanted to bring up, and it's the Terrell brothers. They're from Allegheny County, Virginia. One went to VMI, one went to West Point. They both died during the war, not in battle against one another, but in different battles. They are buried together in Virginia, and that just is another example of the Brothers War. So, Army organization. Both armies were arranged the same. Infantry, foot soldiers were the backbone of day-to-day operations. Artillery, rear echelon support, sort of death from above type of tactics. Cavalry were your eyes, your ears, your scalps. Here's your basic breakdown. You've got 5 squads in a platoon. 2 to 3 platoons make a company. 10 companies make up a regiment. 4 to 6 regiments make up a brigade. 3 brigades make up a division. 3 divisions make up a corps. And 2 to 3 corps make up an army. That is how that comes about. I don't know if you've ever learned that before. Now you know. And this is going to be important. This is going to be a nice reference for us when I'm referring to corps and army and division and brigades throughout. So, for example, when Lee becomes commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, his 2 corps commanders will be Thomas J. Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, and Longstreet, James Longstreet, the old warhorse, also nicknamed Old Pete. This is a more detailed breakdown you guys can refer back to. This is your infantry, artillery, and cavalry breakdown for Union and Confederacy. I'm not going to read through every portion of this, but it goes in reverse order from what we just looked at. It goes squad, platoon from the bottom all the way to the top. That's a good place for us to stop today, all right? So, you guys have any questions? Fantastic.